Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the spring of 1902, when the dogwoods were in full bloom across the rolling hills of the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri, two sisters from the small settlement of Marble Creek would embark on what they thought was a simple foraging expedition. What they discovered in a remote hollow would lead to one of the most troubling and least discussed mysteries in the region's history. Margaret and Elizabeth Thorne, aged 27 and 25 respectively, were known throughout Marble Creek for their knowledge of medicinal plants and skill at finding morel mushrooms that flourished in the damp spring conditions. The sisters lived alone in a modest cabin on the outskirts of town, having lost both parents to influenza in the winter of 1897. They supported themselves by selling herbal remedies, preserves, and occasionally serving as midwives for families too remote to reach the doctor in Springfield. The Thornes were not wealthy by any measure, but they were respected. Their father, Jonathan Thorne, had been the town's blacksmith for 20 years before his death. Their mother, Sarah, had taught at the one-room schoolhouse until illness forced her retirement. The family's standing in the community allowed the sisters to maintain a level of independence unusual for unmarried women of that era. According to town records preserved in the Reynolds County Courthouse, the Thorne sisters had received several marriage proposals in the years following their parents' deaths. Elizabeth's journal entries from 1898 through 1901 reference these offers with a mixture of amusement and irritation. "Mr. Holloway called again today," she wrote in October of 1899. "He spoke at length about how two women should not live alone in these woods and offered himself as protection. Margaret told him we had managed bears and wildcats without male assistance and expected we could manage him as well." This independence, while tolerated, made the sisters somewhat unusual in the eyes of their neighbors. They were welcome at church socials and community gatherings, but maintained a certain distance that some found unsettling. As Elizabeth noted in her journal, "We are viewed as necessary but strange. They come to us for remedies and advice, then whisper about our unmarried state when they think we cannot hear." On April 12, 1902, they set out before dawn to search for spring mushrooms and herbs in an area of the forest they had never before explored. According to Elizabeth's journal, they had been told by an elderly hunter named Jeremiah Blackwood about a fertile valley beyond Pine Ridge that was uncommonly rich in bloodroot and ginseng. What neither sister could have anticipated was how the simple smell of cooking bacon would lead them to a discovery that would haunt the region for decades. The original account, preserved in Elizabeth Thorne's journal and later transcribed in the Reynolds County Historical Society archives in 1959, describes their initial reaction. "We had been walking for perhaps 4 hours when the wind shifted. Margaret stopped suddenly and turned to me. 'Do you smell that?' she asked. 'Bacon. Someone's cooking not far from here.' We were miles from any known homestead. The sisters debated briefly whether to investigate. Elizabeth's journal records her hesitation. 'I reminded Margaret that we had come for bloodroot, not to intrude upon strangers. She replied that anyone living this deep in the forest might have useful knowledge of local plants, and furthermore, we had brought only cold biscuits and jam for our midday meal.' The prospect of hot food was tempting after our long walk. This seemingly innocent decision to follow the scent of cooking rather than continue their planned route would alter the course of their lives and uncover a mystery that remains unresolved to this day. The sisters, hungry from their long trek, followed the scent. It led them through a dense thicket of blackberry brambles and down into a narrow ravine that local maps of the time did not properly document. The path was difficult, with loose shale that slid under their boots. Elizabeth's journal notes, "The smell grew stronger, but something else mingled with it, something sharp and unpleasant that made Margaret cover her nose with her handkerchief. The ravine deepened as they descended, the walls rising on either side until they were walking in near darkness despite the mid-morning sun. The vegetation changed character, becoming more lush, yet somehow unhealthy in appearance. Elizabeth, who meticulously documented plant species in her journals, noted several varieties she could not immediately identify, which was unusual given her extensive knowledge. The ferns here grow to twice their normal size, she wrote, yet their fronds are pale, almost translucent. The moss covering the rock face has a peculiar bluish tint I have never before observed. Even the birdsong has ceased, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the sound of water dripping somewhere out of sight. After approximately half a mile of difficult progress through the ravine, they emerged into a small clearing surrounded by towering oak and hickory trees. The canopy above was so dense that only dappled sunlight reached the forest floor. And there, nestled against the hillside, as if it had grown from the earth itself, stood a cabin. What they found in that remote hollow would never be fully explained by authorities. The small cabin, constructed of rough-hewn oak logs and partially built into the hillside itself, stood in the small clearing. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the smell of cooking that had drawn them there. No sounds of human activity disturbed the eerie stillness. The door stood open, Elizabeth wrote. This struck us immediately as strange. No one leaves a door open in these woods, not with the wolves and bears that roam here. The clearing around the cabin showed signs of habitation, a chopping block with an axe embedded in it, a well with a wooden cover, a small garden plot tilled, but not yet planted for spring. Yet there was a curious absence of personal touches. No rocking chair on the porch, no washing hung to dry, none of the customary signs of daily life that would be expected at even the most humble Ozark homestead. Margaret called out a greeting, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response came. The sisters exchanged glances, their unease growing. "Perhaps they are hunting," Margaret suggested, though her tone conveyed doubt. The smell of bacon remained strong, suggesting whoever had been cooking had departed only moments before their arrival. The cabin itself appeared solid, but somehow wrong in its proportions. The door slightly too tall and narrow, the window small and placed at irregular heights. The Marble Creek Gazette, a small weekly newspaper that served Reynolds County at the time, published only one brief article about what would later be called the Hollow Cabin Incident. The May 3, 1902 edition contained just 3 paragraphs on page 4, sandwiched between advertisements for Pemberton's Cure-All Tonic and Wolcott's General Store. Elizabeth's journal describes their approach to the cabin in careful detail. We crossed the clearing slowly, mindful that we were intruding. The ground beneath our feet was unusually soft, almost spongy, though there had been no recent rain. County Sheriff Daniel Harmon reports that an unoccupied cabin was discovered in the remote wilderness area west of Pine Ridge by local residents. The structure appears to have been abandoned recently. Sheriff Harmon advises citizens to report any strangers in the area, but assures there is no cause for concern. What this sanitized account failed to mention were the details that would emerge years later, when Elizabeth Thorne's journal was discovered during the renovation of the old Thorne property in 1959. The journal, along with several letters exchanged between Margaret Thorne and Reynolds County Judge William Cordery, painted a far more disturbing picture than the newspaper had conveyed. According to these documents, when the sisters cautiously entered the cabin, they found a scene that defied simple explanation. The interior was meticulously organized. A cast-iron skillet sat on the cold wood stove, containing what appeared to be recently cooked bacon, now congealed in its own fat. A rough-hewn table held 3 place settings of mismatched china. A lantern, recently extinguished, judging by the smell of oil, hung from a central beam. It was as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-meal, Elizabeth wrote. The cups still contained coffee, now cold. One chair was overturned. But it was what Margaret found in the back room that caused her to come running out. her face drained of all color. Elizabeth described the main room of the cabin in precise detail, noting elements that struck her as unusual. The fireplace was constructed of river stones fitted together with such precision that no mortar was visible between them. The furniture appeared handcrafted, but with a level of workmanship that seemed at odds with the remote location, each piece showing intricate carving that Elizabeth described as reminiscent of old-world craftsmanship, not the practical plainness one expects in frontier dwellings. Most curious were the contents of a bookshelf built into the wall beside the fireplace. The volumes were bound in leather of unusual quality, Elizabeth wrote. Their titles, when present, were in languages neither of us recognized, not Latin or French, or any tongue taught at the Springfield Academy. Some appeared to be ledgers or journals, their pages filled with cramped handwriting in what looked like cipher. But it was the personal effects scattered throughout the cabin that created the most unsettling impression. Elizabeth noted clothing hung on pegs, cut in styles not seen in these parts for 30 years or more, and a collection of pocket watches arranged precisely on a shelf, all showing different times, yet all apparently wound and running. Margaret, meanwhile, had begun exploring the second room that opened off the main living area. Elizabeth's journal recounts that she remained in the main room, examining the books, when she heard her sister gasp. Before she could investigate, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression one of pure shock. The journal's account of what was discovered in that back room remains incomplete. Several pages appear to have been torn out, and Elizabeth's writing resumes with the sisters already on their way back to Marble Creek, moving as quickly as our trembling legs would carry us. This gap in the narrative has been the subject of intense speculation among historians and researchers of Ozark folklore. What could the sisters have seen that was too disturbing to commit to paper? Why would Elizabeth, who documented everything from weather patterns to bird migrations with scientific precision, deliberately remove these pages from her otherwise meticulous journal? Partial answers came from a separate source. A letter Margaret Thorne wrote to Judge William Cordery in 1917, 15 years after the incident. In this correspondence, discovered among the judge's personal papers after his death, Margaret made reference to what they had found in that room. I trust you will understand why I must inquire whether the items from the back chamber were indeed destroyed as Sheriff Harmon promised. The collection of specimens, particularly those preserved in the glass containers, has haunted my dreams these 15 years. The labels, with their precise documentation of sources and dates, suggest a methodical approach that makes the nature of the collection all the more disturbing. The letter continues with a reference to a map on the wall, marked with locations throughout the Ozarks, homes I realized with horror, including our own, with notes about comings and goings. The realization that we had been observed, perhaps for months, without our knowledge. The letter breaks off at this point, the remainder apparently lost or deliberately removed from the judge's files. What remains, however, suggests a level of surveillance and calculation that goes beyond the actions of an isolated hermit or backwoods settler. Sheriff Harmon, accompanied by 3 deputies, returned to the site the following day after the sisters reported their find. No official report of this expedition exists in county records, an omission that would later fuel decades of speculation among local historians. What is known comes primarily from a personal letter written by Deputy James Whitaker to his brother in St. Louis, discovered in 1968 during research for a family genealogy project. "I've seen things in this war that no man should see," wrote Whitaker, who had served in the Spanish-American conflict 4 years earlier, "but nothing prepared me for what we found in that hollow. The sheriff has ordered us to speak of it to no one, and for once I agree with the old bastard. Some things are better left undisturbed." Whitaker's letter, while avoiding specific descriptions, makes reference to evidence of activities no God-fearing man could condone and indications that whoever, or whatever, had occupied that cabin had been observing the settlements for years, keeping records of every man, woman, and child within 20 miles. Most troubling was his reference to the back room that had so disturbed Margaret Thorne. The collection defies explanation. The sheriff ordered us to burn it all, but I cannot help but wonder if fire is enough to cleanse what we found there. The specimens preserved with a skill no local doctor could match. The implications of their arrangement and categorization. I will say no more, even to you, brother. The cabin was apparently burned to the ground on Sheriff Harmon's orders. No photographs or detailed documentation of its contents were ever officially acknowledged. The area was marked as unsuitable for settlement on county maps revised in 1903, with the entire hollow designated as part of a new hunting reserve that prohibited public access. This official response to destroy evidence, restrict access, and suppress information suggests a level of concern far beyond what would be warranted for the discovery of an abandoned squatter's cabin. The question that would occupy researchers for decades afterward was simple. What did Sheriff Harmon and his men find that required such extreme measures? For the next 2 decades, the incident faded from public memory, mentioned only in hushed conversations among the oldest residents of Marble Creek. The Thorne sisters never publicly discussed what they had seen, though local accounts suggest they abandoned their foraging expeditions entirely and rarely ventured beyond the town limits for the remainder of their lives. According to Reynolds County tax records, the sisters made significant changes to their property in the months following the incident. They constructed a high fence around their cabin, installed iron bars on the windows, and acquired 2 large dogs, German shepherds according to neighbor accounts, that they kept even though Elizabeth had previously expressed a fear of large canines in her journal. The 1905 census records indicate they had taken in a boarder, Samuel Whitaker, younger brother of Deputy James Whitaker. This arrangement raised eyebrows in the small community, but no official objections were raised. Samuel, a blacksmith by trade, who had taken over the shop once run by the sisters' father, reportedly slept on a cot out of the front room of the cabin and was known to carry a shotgun when accompanying the sisters on their increasingly rare trips into town. Elizabeth died of pneumonia in the winter of 1921. Margaret, increasingly reclusive after her sister's death, lived until 1931. According to her will, all personal papers and journals were to be sealed in a cedar chest and stored in the attic of their home, not to be opened until the property passed out of family ownership. Samuel Whitaker continued to live in the cabin until his own death in 1942, after which the property stood vacant for several years. Local children claimed the place was haunted, reporting strange lights and sounds, though these accounts were dismissed as typical childhood imagination. That transition occurred in 1958, when the last Thorne relative, a nephew who had long since relocated to Kansas City, sold the property to developers planning to expand Marble Creek's residential district. During the subsequent renovation, contractor Thomas Weller discovered the cedar chest in the attic, its lock rusted but intact. I probably should have just handed it over to the Historical Society right away, Weller later told the Springfield Daily News in 1962. What I read in those journals kept me awake for weeks afterward. The cedar chest contained not only Elizabeth's journals, but a collection of items carefully wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather-bound book with strange symbols embossed on its cover, a pocket watch with unusual markings on its face, and most curiously, a cloth pouch containing what appeared to be dried herbs, but which, according to Weller, smelled like nothing I'd ever encountered before. Weller, disturbed by what he found in the journals, eventually turned the entire collection over to the Reynolds County Historical Society. But curiosity got the better of me. The Society's curator at the time, Marion Fletcher, recognized the historical significance of the material, but was equally troubled by its contents. After consultation with county officials, a decision was made to restrict access to the more sensitive portions of the collection. The journals and letters, once authenticated by historians from the University of Missouri, revealed a more complete picture of what the Thorne sisters had encountered and why they had chosen to remain silent about it for the rest of their lives. The back room of the cabin, according to the previously missing journal pages found in the cedar chest, contained evidence of activities that defied rational explanation. Elizabeth's descriptions, while methodical, betray her struggle to comprehend what she witnessed. The walls were covered in hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small marks, tally marks, it seemed at first, but upon closer inspection they revealed themselves to be crude figures, each unique, each scratched into the wood with what must have been painstaking precision. Margaret said they looked like family groups, man, woman, child, but distorted somehow, elongated. Between these figures were words or phrases in a script neither of us recognized. More disturbing was the collection of items meticulously arranged on shelves built into the far wall. Elizabeth catalogued them with clinical detachment. Dozens of small cloth pouches containing hair and teeth, carefully labeled with dates spanning back to 1847, jars of preserved organic matter that she declined to describe in detail, and, most puzzling, a series of leather-bound ledgers filled with names, dates, and locations throughout the Ozarks. Margaret recognized several names from Marble Creek and the surrounding settlements, Elizabeth wrote, current residents, their children, all recorded with precise details about their daily movements, occupations, and relations. The most recent entry was dated April 11th, yesterday. The map on the wall that Margaret referenced in her later letter to Judge Cordery was described in more detail in Elizabeth's journal. It covered most of the Ozark region with small red pins marking various locations. Next to each pin was a number that corresponded to entries in one of the ledgers. The Thorne cabin was marked with pin number 27, with a notation in the margin that read, 2 females, no regular male visitors, isolated, extensive knowledge of local terrain. Elizabeth noted that many of the pins corresponded to homes with children, particularly those in remote locations. This observation clearly disturbed her, as her normally neat handwriting becomes erratic at this point in the journal. But it was the discovery in the root cellar, accessed through a trapdoor beneath a rug, that sent the sisters fleeing. Elizabeth's account of this discovery is fragmentary, as if she could not bring herself to record it completely. The smell that greeted us when Margaret pulled open the trapdoor caused us both to gag. A circular staircase of stone descended into darkness. Margaret took the lantern and led the way, despite my protests. I followed, fearing more for her safety than my own curiosity. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a chamber much larger than seemed possible given the size of the cabin above. The walls were not of wood, but of stone, suggesting the chamber had been here long before the cabin was built atop it. What they found in that underground chamber is described in just one chilling paragraph. Tables of rough wood filled the space, each bearing objects that I will not describe here. Tools hung on the walls, some familiar, some whose purpose I dare not contemplate. In the center stood a larger table, its surface stained dark. Above it hung a complex arrangement of ropes and pulleys connected to various receptacles. Margaret approached one table where a ledger lay open. She read a few lines, then turned to me with an expression I had never seen on my sister's face before. Not fear, but a terrible understanding. "They know about us, Lizzie," she whispered. "They've been watching us. They know when we sleep." It was then we heard the boards creak overhead. The sisters fled, not bothering to close the trapdoor behind them. Elizabeth's journal indicates they took nothing from the cabin except one of the ledgers that Margaret grabbed instinctively as they ran. They did not follow their original path, but instead crashed through the underbrush in their panic, becoming briefly lost before finding the main trail back to Marble Creek. A curious detail appears in Elizabeth's account of their flight. As we ran, I glanced back once. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall, impossibly thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed too formal for these woods. Though I could not make out the face clearly, I had the distinct impression it was smiling. Then we rounded a bend in the trail, and it was lost from view. This is the only reference in any of the documents to a potential occupant of the cabin being sighted. Whether this figure was real or a product of Elizabeth's terrified imagination has been debated by researchers, but no other witnesses ever reported seeing anyone matching this description in the area. Upon their return, they immediately sought out Sheriff Harmon. His reaction, as recorded in Margaret's later correspondence with Judge Cordery, was telling. He did not seem surprised by our account, Margaret wrote in 1917, responding to the judge's inquiry about old local legends. He asked few questions, but was particularly interested in whether we had seen any occupants or taken anything from the premises. When I mentioned the ledger, his face changed. He insisted we turn it over to him immediately, which we did. I have often wondered if that decision saved our lives. The ledger, according to Margaret's letter, contained not only names and observations, but detailed plans that she could not bring herself to describe even 15 years later. Suffice to say, she wrote, that had those plans been carried out, many families in Marble Creek would have suffered losses too terrible to contemplate. Sheriff Harmon and his deputies allegedly visited the site the following day. According to Deputy Whitaker's letter, they found the cabin abandoned but intact, exactly as the sisters had described it. The ledgers, cloth pouches, and other disturbing items were collected and loaded into saddlebags. The underground chamber was examined, its contents removed or destroyed. Before departing, Harmon ordered the cabin burned to the ground. What became of the collected evidence remains unknown. No official record of these items appears in county archives. Judge Cordery, in his response to Margaret's 1917 letter, claimed all materials had been disposed of appropriately and suggested that continued discussion of this matter serves no good purpose for the peace and stability of our community. This apparent conspiracy of silence among local officials raises troubling questions. Were they simply protecting the community from disturbing knowledge, or was there something more sinister at work? The lack of official documentation makes it impossible to know with certainty. Perhaps most disturbing are the implications in Margaret's final letter to Judge Cordery, written just months before his death in 1924. I remain convinced that our actions in 1902 did not end the matter, but merely drove it deeper into the shadows. I have observed certain signs over the years: missing livestock attributed to wolves, travelers who pass through Marble Creek but never reach their destinations, the peculiar marks sometimes found carved into trees along remote trails. They are still here, Judge. They have simply become more careful. This letter suggests that whatever the sisters discovered in that hollow continued to operate in the region, albeit more discreetly. Margaret's observations of missing travelers find some corroboration in county records. Between 1902 and 1924, the number of unexplained disappearances in Reynolds County increased slightly compared to previous decades, though most were attributed to accidents or voluntary departures. Following the discovery of these documents in 1959, amateur historian and Reynolds County librarian Josephine Wheeler attempted to locate the site of the cabin. Using Elizabeth's journal descriptions and county maps from the early 1900s, she identified several possible locations in what was by then designated as part of the Mark Twain National Forest. Wheeler's research notes, preserved in the Reynolds County Historical Society archives, reveal a methodical approach to narrowing down the location. She cross-referenced Elizabeth's descriptions of landmarks with U.S. Geological Survey maps, consulted Forest Service records regarding terrain features, and interviewed elderly residents who might have known of the area before it was incorporated into the National Forest. The ravine described by Elizabeth Thorne corresponds to several possible locations, Wheeler wrote in January 1961. The most promising is an unnamed drainage approximately 7.3 miles west-northwest of what was once Marble Creek. Current maps show it as part of the headwaters of Panther Creek, though in 1902 it would have been unmapped territory. Wheeler organized 3 expeditions between 1961 and 1963, all officially for the purpose of cataloging native plant species. Her private notes, donated to the Reynolds County Historical Society after her death in 1975, tell a different story. First expedition, May 1961, located what appears to be the ravine described in the Thorne Journal, she wrote. The passage is narrower than current maps indicate, with unusual rock formations that match Elizabeth's descriptions. Located cleared area approximately 1/2 mile from the ravine entrance that could have been the cabin site, though no structural remains were visible. Soil samples taken for analysis. Her second expedition in June 1962 ventured deeper into the area. Located depression in the ground at the clearing site that suggests a collapsed underground structure, she noted. Limited excavation revealed charred wood fragments and what appears to be melted glass, consistent with a structure destroyed by fire. Most intriguing was the discovery of stone steps leading downward at the north edge of the depression, though debris prevented exploration of where they might lead. Wheeler's third and final expedition in October 1963 ended abruptly and without explanation in her notes. Her terse entry reads only, "Third attempt to locate hollow cabin site unsuccessful. Landmarks described in Thorne Journal no longer identifiable due to logging operations in the 1940s. Local guide Isaiah Collins claims his grandfather once knew the location but was warned never to approach it. Collins' family lore suggests at least 7 people who attempted to find the site between 1902 and 1930 disappeared without trace. Cannot verify these claims through official records, though county death records from this period are notably incomplete. Wheeler's final entry on the subject, dated December 1963, suggests she had decided to abandon her search. Received anonymous letter today warning against further expeditions. Writer claims to be descended from one of Harmon's deputies and states that some secrets are buried for good reason. Letter included a small cloth pouch containing what appears to be human hair. Have decided professional opportunities in Springfield warrant relocation. Will leave my notes for future researchers, but cannot recommend pursuit of this matter. Wheeler moved to Springfield shortly after this entry and never returned to the hollow cabin research. When interviewed in 1970 by a graduate student researching Ozark folklore, she refused to discuss the subject, stating only that some historical mysteries are best left unresolved. The hollow cabin case might have remained buried in historical obscurity if not for an unexpected discovery in 1968. During renovation of the old Reynolds County Courthouse, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a brick wall in what had been Judge Cordery's chambers. Inside was a tin box containing several items: a key with no identifying marks, a small leather-bound book with most pages torn out, and a sealed envelope addressed to "the person who finds this." The letter inside, written by Judge Cordery shortly before his death, was brief but troubling. "I have carried the burden of knowledge too long. Sheriff Harmon believed burning the cabin and sealing the records would end the matter. He was wrong. They came from elsewhere and have gone elsewhere, but not far." The ledger the Thorne women found contained evidence of their activities dating back to 1832, with entries from 5 states. They follow patterns only visible when one maps their movements across decades. I have done so, and what I found has convinced me they operate by design, not chance. I leave this record knowing it is incomplete. Some evils cannot be confronted directly, but must be carefully watched. May God forgive me for the silence I have kept. The remaining pages of the book contained what appeared to be a partial copy of names and dates from the ledger Margaret Thorne had taken from the cabin. Analysis by historical researchers suggested the entries documented not victims, as initially supposed, but observers, people who, like the Thorne sisters, had stumbled upon evidence of the group's activities and subsequently been monitored. Next to some names were small notations, handled or relocated, or most commonly, watching. Next to the entry for Elizabeth and Margaret Thorne was written simply, "aware but contained." This discovery prompted renewed interest in the case. The Reynolds County Historical Society established a special committee to review all available evidence and determine whether further investigation was warranted. Their findings, published in a limited internal report in 1969, acknowledged the disturbing nature of the historical accounts but concluded that insufficient physical evidence exists to support claims of organized malevolent activity in the region during the period in question. The report suggested that the Thorne sisters had likely stumbled upon the cabin of an eccentric hermit or possibly a small, isolated religious sect, and that their interpretation of what they found had been colored by the superstitions common in rural communities of the era. Judge Cordery's apparent belief in a broader conspiracy was attributed to the influence of advancing age and possible senility. Not everyone was satisfied with these conclusions. Among the skeptics was Dr. Eleanor Harper, an anthropologist from Washington University who specialized in isolated cultural groups in the American backcountry. After reviewing the available documents, Harper proposed an alternative theory. What the historical record suggests, she wrote in a 1970 paper published in the Journal of American Folklore, is the possible existence of an itinerant group that periodically established temporary settlements in remote areas. Their purpose appears to have been observation and documentation of surrounding communities, though to what end remains unclear. The collection of personal items, hair, teeth, etc., suggests ritualistic behavior consistent with certain European folk traditions transplanted to the American frontier but altered over generations of isolation. Harper's theory, while more measured than some of the more sensationalistic interpretations, still proposed the existence of what she termed a shadow community, operating on the fringes of established settlements. Her attempt to secure funding for field research in the Ozarks to investigate this possibility was denied by the university, and she eventually abandoned the project. In the summer of 1969, an archaeology student from the University of Missouri named Robert Keller became interested in the hollow cabin case while researching his dissertation on pre-settlement structures in the Ozarks. Keller obtained permission to conduct limited excavations in the area Wheeler had identified as the most likely location of the cabin site. Keller's field notes, more comprehensive than Wheeler's, document a systematic approach to the excavation. Site survey revealed a roughly circular depression, approximately 20 feet in diameter, he wrote in June 1969. Vegetation patterns suggest a structure once stood here with certain plants, particularly nightshade and a variant of foxglove, growing in unusual concentration around the perimeter. After 3 weeks of searching, Keller's team located a promising site, a small level area on a hillside with evidence of previous construction, including old foundation stones and charred wood fragments consistent with a structure destroyed by fire. Carbon dating later confirmed these materials originated from approximately 1900–1905. What most interested Keller, however, was what lay beneath these remains. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a cave system extending into the hillside, with evidence of modification by human hands. University authorities granted permission for limited exploration. Initial excavation revealed a stone staircase descending approximately 12 feet below ground level, Keller noted in July 1969. The construction method is inconsistent with typical Ozark building techniques of the early 1900s. The stones are fitted with unusual precision, without mortar, in a style more reminiscent of colonial Spanish construction than local traditions. The subsequent expedition, documented in Keller's field notes, but omitted from his official dissertation, uncovered troubling evidence. The cave entrance had been sealed with a crude concrete mixture sometime in the 1920s or 1930s. Once this barrier was breached, the team discovered a chamber whose dimensions matched Elizabeth Thorne's description of the root cellar. The chamber was empty of the items she had described, but certain features remained. Iron rings embedded in the walls and ceiling, drainage channels carved into the stone floor, and, most notably, a series of symbols etched into the far wall that matched no known language or Native American pictographs. Keller photographed these symbols and later consulted with linguists and anthropologists, none of whom could identify their origin or meaning. The closest parallel, according to Dr. Martin Roth of Columbia University, was with certain alchemical notations found in 17th century European manuscripts, though the resemblance may be coincidental rather than indicative of direct influence. Most significant was the discovery of a narrow tunnel leading deeper into the hillside. Safety concerns and inadequate equipment prevented full exploration, but Keller noted the tunnel appeared to extend for hundreds of yards and showed signs of regular use over many decades, with different tool marks visible at various sections. The tunnel appears to connect to other chamber systems, Keller wrote. We detected air movement, suggesting additional openings elsewhere in the hillside or perhaps even beyond. The implications are disturbing, that what the Thorne sisters discovered was merely one entrance to a much larger complex. University officials, citing safety concerns, ordered the excavation sealed and the site backfilled. Keller's requests for additional funding to continue the exploration were denied. His dissertation, when published in 1971, contained only a brief mention of evidence of pre-1900 habitation at the site, with no reference to the underground chambers or their possible connection to the hollow cabin incident. The university's decision to halt the excavation and limit publication of the findings has itself become a subject of speculation. Official records cite concerns about structural stability and the potential hazards of cave exploration. However, internal memos obtained through Freedom of Information requests in the 1990s suggest additional motivations. The discovery of an extensive tunnel system raises jurisdictional questions regarding Forest Service land management, wrote Dean Harold Wilson to the university president in August 1969. Furthermore, certain aspects of Mr. Keller's findings, if publicized, could attract unwanted attention to the region and potentially encourage unauthorized excavations by amateur treasure hunters or those interested in the more sensationalistic aspects of local folklore. A more troubling note appears in a separate memo from the university's legal department. Advise extreme caution regarding any claims about human activity in the underground chambers. Evidence is circumstantial at best, and implications of historical wrongdoing could expose the university to liability issues, particularly given the sensitive nature of some speculations regarding the site's purpose. Keller died in a hiking accident in Colorado in 1973. His field notes, along with photographs and soil samples from the excavation, were supposedly transferred to the university archives. When researchers attempted to access these materials in 1986, they were informed all items related to the excavation had been lost during an archive reorganization in 1978. The circumstances of Keller's death have themselves become part of the hollow cabin mythology. Official reports describe a straightforward accident, a fall from a steep trail in Rocky Mountain National Park while hiking alone. However, colleagues noted that Keller had been an experienced mountaineer who rarely took unnecessary risks. More troubling were reports that he had been preparing a more comprehensive paper on his Ozark excavations in the months before his death, though no manuscript was found among his personal effects. The last significant development in the hollow cabin case came in 1968, when elderly Marble Creek resident Howard Blackwood, grandson of the Jeremiah Blackwood, who had originally told the Thorne sisters about the Fertile Valley, contacted the Reynolds County Historical Society with information he claimed had been passed down through his family. According to Blackwood, who was 82 at the time of the interview, his grandfather had not merely known of the valley, but had specific reasons for directing the sisters there. In a recorded interview conducted in the Reynolds County Library, Blackwood claimed his grandfather had his own disturbing encounter in that hollow in 1879 while tracking a wounded deer. Grandpa said he saw people there that didn't belong, Blackwood stated. Folks dressed like it was 50 years earlier, speaking in whispers. He hid and watched them carrying something wrapped in canvas into the hillside. There was a cabin then, too, but different from the one the sisters found. Smaller. Grandpa said these people weren't like normal folks. They moved strangely, kept their faces turned away. He left without being seen, but told no one, except his wife. Blackwood's testimony adds a significant dimension to the case, suggesting the hollow had been used by the mysterious group for at least 23 years before the Thorne sisters' discovery, and that the cabin itself had been rebuilt or expanded during that time. It also indicates that Jeremiah Blackwood deliberately sent the sisters to investigate, rather than their discovery being purely accidental. Grandpa carried that secret for years, Howard continued in his interview. It ate at him, knowing they were out there watching folks, but not knowing why or what they might be planning. He said sometimes he'd be hunting and feel eyes on him, though he never saw anyone. He'd find those strange marks carved into trees near his trap lines. Once he found one of his hunting dogs dead near the hollow, laid out straight with its paws crossed, like it was being displayed. Blackwood claimed his grandfather later learned of other sightings from indigenous Osage hunters who avoided the hollow. They called it the place where the hungry ones live, said it had been that way since before white settlers came. This reference to indigenous knowledge suggests the site might have been considered unusual or forbidden long before European settlement of the region. Archaeological records confirm that the Ozarks were inhabited by various Native American groups for thousands of years before white settlers arrived, with the Osage being dominant in the area during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Osage oral traditions, as documented by anthropologist James Owen Dorsey in the 1880s, include references to certain locations in the Ozarks being avoided due to associations with those who watch from shadows, or the thin people who are always hungry. These vague references had previously been interpreted as typical taboo sites or places associated with natural dangers, but Blackwood's account suggests they might have had a more specific referent. Most troublingly, Blackwood suggested his grandfather had deliberately sent the Thorne sisters to the hollow. He was dying of cancer, though nobody called it that back then. He wanted someone to find what was there, someone respectable who would be believed. He chose those sisters because they were known to be honest and God-fearing. I think he believed they might end whatever was happening there. If this account is accurate, it casts the entire incident in a new light, not as a random discovery, but as a deliberate attempt by Jeremiah Blackwood to expose activities he had observed but felt powerless to stop. It also raises questions about his own safety during the decades he apparently kept this knowledge to himself. Did he remain unharmed because he never directly interfered, or were there consequences that went unrecorded? When asked why he was coming forward after so many decades, Blackwood's response was unsettling. Because they're coming back. I've seen the signs. Every 66 years they become active again. It's been their pattern. 1770, 1836, 1902, and now it's 1968. Watch for missing persons. Watch for lights in the deep woods. And whatever you do, don't follow the smell of cooking, no matter how hungry you get. This specific time frame, a 66-year cycle of increased activity, had not been previously proposed in any of the historical documents. Blackwood's suggestion of a pattern stretching back to 1770, before American independence, implies a much longer history than had been considered and raises questions about the origins and nature of the group involved. Blackwood died 3 months after the interview. The Historical Society buried his testimony in their archives, dismissing it as the ramblings of a senile old man. No researchers followed up on his warnings, and no unusual pattern of disappearances was officially noted in the region in the late 1960s. However, independent researcher Catherine Yates, while compiling data for her 2008 book, Forgotten Mysteries of the Ozarks, uncovered an interesting pattern. In reviewing missing persons reports from Reynolds and adjacent counties, she noted slight statistical spikes occurring approximately every 66 years, just as Blackwood had suggested. These spikes were small enough to escape casual notice, but consistent enough to raise questions. Between 1967 and 1970, Yates wrote, 11 people were reported missing in the immediate vicinity of what would have been the hollow cabin site. All were dismissed as probable relocations, hunting accidents, or runaways. None of the bodies were ever recovered. Similar patterns appear in the historical record around 1901, 1903, 1835, 1837, and to the extent records exist, in the 1770s as well. Yates noted that most of these disappearances shared certain characteristics. They typically involved individuals traveling alone on remote roads or trails. They occurred disproportionately in autumn months, and in many cases, the missing person had mentioned unusual smells or sounds in the woods to acquaintances shortly before their disappearance. Most striking, Yates continued, is that despite extensive searches, no traces were ever found of any of these missing persons. No clothing, no personal effects, nothing to indicate what might have happened to them. It was as if they had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Yates attempted to locate the cave system Keller had partially explored, but the exact coordinates had been redacted from all accessible records. Forest Service maps showed the entire area had been redesignated as a watershed protection zone in 1975, with public access prohibited. My inquiries to the Forest Service regarding this redesignation were met with bureaucratic obstruction, Yates wrote. Officials cited water quality concerns and endangered species protection as justifications, but could provide no specific documentation of either issue. When pressed, a regional supervisor informed me that the decision had been made at the highest levels and was not open to review. This apparent governmental reluctance to allow access to the area has fueled conspiracy theories among some local residents and amateur researchers. Some suggest a cover-up of environmental contamination. Others propose more exotic explanations involving classified military testing or even extraterrestrial activity. However, no credible evidence supports these more sensational claims. In her final chapter, Yates offered a theory about the hollow cabin incident that tied together the fragmentary evidence. What the Thorne sisters stumbled upon appears to have been one outpost of a group that has operated in the Ozark region for at least 2 centuries. Their activities intensify in regular cycles, but never cease entirely. The evidence suggests an organized effort to monitor isolated communities, possibly for the purpose of selecting individuals who won't be immediately missed. Yates stopped short of speculating about the group's ultimate purpose, noting only that the physical evidence, particularly the modifications to the underground chambers, suggests activities incompatible with normal human habitation or standard religious practices of any known sect. Her reluctance to offer more specific theories likely stems from the limited concrete evidence available. They select remote locations, establish temporary bases that include access to existing cave systems, and then move on when their presence is detected. The fragmentary nature of the historical record, combined with the apparent reluctance of officials to pursue the matter, has left the true nature and purpose of the hollow cabin occupants largely a matter of speculation. In 2012, folklorist Dr. Samuel Barton of the University of Arkansas conducted a series of interviews with elderly residents of communities throughout the Ozarks, focusing on local legends and beliefs about forbidden or dangerous places in the woods. His research, published in the Journal of American Folklore, identified several recurring themes that echo elements of the hollow cabin case. Across dozens of communities separated by considerable distances, Barton wrote, I encountered variations of what might be called the Watcher in the Woods motif, stories of strange, thin figures observed at a distance, often described as wearing outdated clothing and exhibiting unusual patterns of movement. These figures are typically associated with disappearances, particularly of solitary travelers, and with remote hollows or caves that local residents avoid. Barton noted that these stories were most prevalent among families with deep roots in the region, those whose ancestors had settled the Ozarks in the early 19th century or before. Many of these tales included specific warnings about sensory lures, particularly the smell of cooking food, where no habitation should exist. The consistency of these motifs across geographically dispersed communities suggests either a common point of origin for the legend or, more troublingly, a shared experience that has been incorporated into the folklore of the region, Barton concluded. While a skeptical approach is warranted, the specificity and persistence of these accounts raises questions about what historical events might have inspired them. The Hollow Cabin case remains officially unclosed, but inactive. The Reynolds County Historical Society maintains a small file of related documents, most donated by researchers like Wheeler and Yates, who eventually abandoned their investigations. The site itself, if the speculations about its location are correct, now lies beneath the waters of Clearwater Lake, created by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 1948, or at least that's the official position. Some local researchers dispute this conclusion, arguing that the most likely location of the cabin site is actually several miles from the current shoreline of Clearwater Lake. These alternative theories place the hollow in areas that remain accessible, though heavily forested and difficult to navigate. Jason Merritt, an amateur historian and lifelong resident of Reynolds County, has spent decades attempting to reconcile the various accounts and map references to determine the true location of the hollow. In a self-published monograph titled Shadows in the Ozarks, 2015, Merritt presents a compelling case that the cabin site lies within what is now a remote section of the Mark Twain National Forest, in an area rarely visited even by experienced hikers. The terrain is exceptionally difficult, Merritt writes. The ravine described in the Thorne Journal matches a formation locally known as Devil's Gulch, a narrow, twisting passage so overgrown that it's nearly invisible until you're standing at its entrance. I've attempted to follow it to its conclusion on 3 occasions, but have always been turned back by fallen trees, dense underbrush, or in one case, an overwhelming sense of being watched that I cannot rationally explain. Merritt's research has garnered little attention from academic historians who tend to dismiss his work as speculative. However, his meticulous approach to triangulating locations based on historical accounts has earned him respect among local history enthusiasts and folklore collectors. In 2018, Merritt reported finding carved symbols on trees near the entrance to the ravine he believes led to the cabin site. Symbols that bear a striking resemblance to those described in Keller's excavation notes from 1969. Photographs of these carvings show geometric patterns arranged in a way that suggests a written language, though linguists consulted by Merritt could not identify it as any known script. Perhaps the most disturbing epilogue to the story comes not from official records, but from local folklore. In the small communities that dot the eastern Ozarks, a warning has been passed down through generations. If you're deep in the woods and smell cooking when no cabin's in sight, turn around. Don't follow the bacon. This specific reference to bacon, rather than food more generally, suggests a direct connection to the Thorne sisters' experience. The persistence of this warning across more than a century indicates how deeply the incident, or at least stories of it, affected the collective consciousness of the region. Residents still report occasional incidents. Hunters who detect the aroma of food cooking miles from any known habitation. Hikers who glimpse oddly dressed figures watching from ridgelines. Backpackers who discover crude symbols carved into trees along remote trails. Park rangers dismiss these reports as imagination fueled by old legends or, in some cases, the activities of isolated individuals living off the grid. But some locals, particularly those with deep family roots in the region, take the old warnings seriously. They avoid certain hollows, particularly after sunset. They travel in groups when venturing into the more remote sections of the Mark Twain National Forest, and they teach their children to beware of strangers who seem too interested in their daily routines. In 2019, an incident occurred that briefly reignited interest in the Hollow Cabin case. A group of geology students from Southeast Missouri State University conducting field research in a remote area of the Mark Twain National Forest reported finding what appeared to be a recently abandoned campsite in a small clearing. According to their account, published in the Marble Creek Gazette, the site contained several unusual features. There was a small fire pit with ashes still warm, reported graduate student Melissa Chen. Around it were 3 folding chairs, positioned as if for a meal. On a portable table nearby sat 3 plates with partially eaten food, bacon and eggs, according to Chen, that appeared fresh despite there being no one in the vicinity. The students reported the find to Forest Service rangers, who investigated the site the following day but found nothing. No fire pit, no chairs, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The rangers suggested the students had either reported the wrong location or had fabricated the story. The university stood by its students, however, noting that all were academic scholars in good standing with no history of practical jokes or attention-seeking behavior. This incident, while impossible to verify independently, echoes elements of the original Thorne sisters' experience, particularly the abandoned meal and the mysterious disappearance of all evidence. It suggests that whatever was happening in those woods in 1902 might, as Howard Blackwood warned, be cyclical in nature. As for the Thorne sisters, their legacy lives on in the collection of medicinal plant knowledge they documented before their fateful discovery. Their original homestead, now restored as a historical site, draws occasional tourists interested in traditional Ozark herbalism. Tour guides make no mention of the hollow cabin incident, focusing instead on the sisters' contributions to preserving local knowledge of natural remedies. The cedar chest that contained their journals is displayed in the Reynolds County Museum, though the journals themselves are conspicuously absent, allegedly removed for conservation purposes in the 1980s and never returned to public display. Requests to access these materials for research purposes are routinely denied. Museum curator Elaine Winters, when pressed on this point by a reporter in 2020, would say only that some historical materials are too fragile for public handling, and that the full contents of the Thorne collection have been digitized for preservation. Repeated Freedom of Information Act requests for access to these digital copies have been denied on increasingly technical grounds. The descendants of Sheriff Harmon and Judge Cordery still live in the region. Most refuse to discuss their ancestors' connection to the case, though James Cordery, great-grandson of the judge, once told a local historian that family lore held the judge had taken care of a problem that needed taking care of, and that some things were better left in the ground. What really happened to the people who occupied that cabin in 1902? What was the purpose of their meticulous record-keeping and disturbing collection of personal items? Did they, as Judge Cordery suggested, simply relocate to continue their activities elsewhere? The historical record offers no definitive answers. If Howard Blackwood's cyclical theory holds true, the next period of increased activity would occur in the early 2030s. Perhaps somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Ozarks, in some remote hollow, where cell signals don't reach and GPS coordinates blur, another cabin stands with smoke rising from the chimney and the scent of bacon drifting through the trees, waiting to draw in the unwary. But the most troubling question remains unanswered. If the Thorne sisters merely stumbled upon this operation by chance, how many other such sites might exist, undetected in the remote corners of America? And what happens to those who, unlike Margaret and Elizabeth, don't manage to escape and report what they've found? Local author and folklorist William Stevens perhaps put it best in his 2022 collection, Whispers from the Hollows. The deepest fears in the Ozarks have never been of ghosts or monsters or supernatural forces. The real terror lies in the possibility that something walks among us that looks human but isn't. Something that watches and waits and occasionally takes what it needs when no one is looking. Something patient enough to wait decades between actions, calculating enough to leave almost no evidence, and old enough to have been doing this since before we built our towns and cities. The hollow cabin case represents one of the most persistent mysteries in Ozark folklore, a story that has endured for more than a century despite limited physical evidence and official disinterest. Whether interpreted as an actual historical event or as a folk narrative reflecting deeper anxieties about isolation and vulnerability in wilderness areas, it continues to resonate with residents and visitors alike. For many locals, it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking in the seemingly empty spaces on the map. For researchers, it represents a tantalizing glimpse into a possible hidden history of the region, one documented only in fragments and whispers. And for the curious visitor hiking the remote trails of the Mark Twain National Forest, it offers a frisson of fear when the wind shifts and brings an unexpected scent through the ancient trees. Some mysteries, as Sheriff Harmon understood, are perhaps better left unsolved. Some doors, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. And some knowledge, once gained, can never be forgotten, as the Thorne sisters learned on that spring morning in 1902, when they followed the smell of bacon deep into the Ozark woods.